Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. My scheduled guest is our favorite Republican, Ed Mandel. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, July 31st, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humanae ingeni est, odissi cum laceris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. While President Trump is talking peace with the leaders of Russia, North Korea, and even Iran, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are not aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them ringing Russia and China. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. That's the reason that polls show that around the world, the United States is known as the most dangerous country in the world. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the, quote, greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, close quote, an international criminal surpassing all others. But most Americans don't know that, protected as they are by government and media propaganda. What we do here at Aware on the Air is talk about the unmentionable, U.S. government killing around the world, and encourage our fellow citizens to oppose it. Just this week, we've heard that U.S. drone warfare in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia has killed up to 1,500 civilians and comprises up to 5,000 strikes. But keep in mind that that war is still a secret. The U.S. doesn't keep records of our own drone assassinations, and the U.S. has no real idea whom we're killing, whether targeted or passersby. Each missile creates so much damage and vaporizes so many people, we just don't know the truth about the scope of the assassinations the U.S. is responsible for in the drone war. But we do know that this continues escalating across U.S. administrations, and the victims include Americans and children. All are killed extrajudicially. No charges, no evidence, no trial, and no chance for defense or rebuttal. That's purposely forbidden in the U.S. Constitution, but the U.S. government continues it nonetheless. As one commentator with experience in the field said this week, the war in Afghanistan is not getting better, it's getting worse. And drones are a part of that as well. Meanwhile, the political situation in America continues to be ambiguous at best. The Israeli daily Haaretz reports this morning that after Trump said there would be no preconditions on a meeting with Iran, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, contradicted him and set preconditions. It's becoming clearer to Americans that Trump is a threat to the war policies and the war provocations of the U.S. government, the ongoing war provocations of the U.S. government, and steps are being taken by the permanent government, what some people call the deep state, to see that Trump does not disturb those war provocations or those ongoing wars. There are some even suggest that in regard to Iran, the U.S. is scheming for a new Pearl Harbor. This seems to be the only way the government can get backing for a war with Iran in this country. It's important to realize, and here is another area in which Americans are misled by the world's greatest propaganda system, the American media. It's worthwhile to remember that the Second World War how the Second World War started. Roosevelt did the same thing with Japan that the American government looks like doing in regard to Iran. Washington laid out terms of surrender before Pearl Harbor after cutting off Japan's oil. No nation in the world would have accepted such a humiliation. The U.S. wanted war then, in 1940, and the question is how united the war front is now on war with Iran. The issue is much the same, and the provocation is much the same. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about various aspects of the current war situation in America. The following is what has been called a paleo-conservative view. Paleo means old style conservatism. And in American political lexicon, old style conservatism probably hasn't existed except in very few places, like the one I'm about to read, since the death of Robert Taft. Old style conservatism, paleo conservatism, excoriated as isolationism by the Democratic Party in ascendancy, does not exist much more, although it seems to be making a possible recovery in some of the disordered current discussion of American foreign policy. One of the last of the paleo-conservatives is Patrick Buchanan, and he has a piece this week about the way in which, as he says, Trump is edging towards the defining battle of his presidency, a reshaping of U.S. foreign policy to avoid clashes and conflicts with Russia and the shedding of Cold War commitments no longer rooted in the national interests of the country. His point is that the opposition of the permanent government, the deep state, to these moves towards peace are very dangerous. It was exactly because exactly because Trump suggested things like this during the presidential campaign that the so-called neoconservatives, the pro-war party, fled the Republicans and supported a tried and true warmonger, Hillary Clinton. Buchanan writes, quote, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, close quote. Under the Constitution, these are the offenses for which presidents can be impeached. A high crime is a crime done under color of government. A high crime is not a private crime, as it were, but a crime by a government official. To hear our elites, Donald Trump is guilty of all three: treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Trump's refusal to challenge Vladimir Putin's claim at Helsinki that his GRU boys did not hack Hillary Clinton's campaign has been called treason, a refusal to do his sworn duty to protect and defend the United States by no less than a former director of the CIA. Slowly but surely, Trump is boxing his opponents into a corner. All they can do is shriek and scream. Famed journalists and former high officials of the U.S. government have called Russia's hacking of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, an act of war comparable to the attack on Pearl Harbor. You have to read this stuff to believe it. The New York Times ran a story on how many are now charging Trump with treason. Others suggest Putin is blackmailing Trump, or has him on his payroll, or compromised Trump a long time ago. wailed Congressman Steve Cohen, quote, "Where is our military, folks? The commander-in-chief is in the hands of the enemy," close quote. I mean, this is not an episode of a television drama. This is what's been going on this last couple of months in Washington. Apparently, some on the left believe we need a military coup in the U.S. to save our democracy. Something of a contradiction in terms at best. Not since Robert Welsh of the John Birch Society, and you have to be my age to remember him, called Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, a, quote, conscious agent of the communist conspiracy, close quote, this was in the 1950s, have such charges been hurled at a president. But while the Birchers, the John Birch Society, were a bit outside the mainstream, today it's the establishment itself bawling treason. What explains this hysteria? The worst-case scenario would be that the establishment actually believes the nonsense it's spouting. But that is hard to credit. Like the boy who cried wolf, the establishment has cried fascist too many times to be taken seriously. A month ago, the Never-Trumpers were comparing the separation of immigrant kids from detained adults who brought them to the U.S. illegally, obviously a terrible thing to do, but they were comparing that to FDR's concentration camps for Japanese Americans. Some commentators equated the separations to what the Nazis did at Auschwitz. If the establishment truly believed this nonsense, it would be an unacceptable security risk to let them near the levers of power ever again. The separations of families, of refugee families, is a terrible thing, of course, but it's being used by the war party and the Democrats to attack Trump with these fantastic comparisons. The point is to get rid of this dangerous chief executive who will not keep up the war provocations that have been the stock in trade of the American presidency for more than a generation. Using Occam's razor, the real explanation for this behavior by the political establishment is the simplest one. America's elites have been driven over the edge by Trump's successes and their failures to block him. Trump is deregulating the economy, cutting taxes, appointing record numbers of federal judges, reshaping the Supreme Court, and using tariffs to cut trade deficits and the bully pulpit, his tweets, to castigate freeloading allies. Worst of all, Trump clearly intends to carry out his campaign pledge to improve relations with Russia and get along with Vladimir Putin. Over our dead bodies, the Beltway elite seem to be shouting. Hence the rhetorical weapons of mass destruction hurled at Trump. Liar, dictator, authoritarian, Putin's poodle, fascist, demagogue, traitor, Nazi. This is what the American political establishment is calling Donald Trump. Such language approaches incitement to violence. One wonders if the haters are considering the impact of the words they're so casually using. Some of us yet recall how Dallas was charged with complicity in the death of JFK, of John Kennedy, for slurs far less toxic than this. The post-Helsinki hysteria reveals not merely the mindset of the president's enemies, but the depth of their determination to destroy him. They intend to break Trump and bring him down, to see him impeached, removed, indicted, and prosecuted, and the agenda on which he ran and was nominated and elected dumped into the ash heap of history. Last Thursday, Trump indicated that he knows exactly what is afoot, and threw down the gauntlet of defiance. Quote, "The fake news media wants so badly to see a major confrontation with Russia, even a confrontation that could lead to war. They are pushing so recklessly hard and hate the fact that I'll probably have a good relationship with Putin," close quote. That's what Trump himself said, and he is accurately, I think, described the madness that has occupied the war party and its press for war provocations and continuing wars in the world at large. Trump is saying, I am going to call off this Cold War too before it breaks out into the hot war that 9 U.S. presidents avoided, despite Soviet provocations far graver than Putin's pilfering of DNC emails showing how Debbie Wasserman Schultz stuck it to Bernie Sanders. Then the White House suggested Vlad may be coming to dinner this fall. Trump is edging towards the defining battle of his presidency, a reshaping of U.S. foreign policy to avoid clashes and conflicts with Russia, and the shedding of Cold War commitments no longer rooted in the national interests of this country. Yet should he attempt to carry out this agenda, to get out of Syria, pull troops out of Germany, take a second look at NATO's Article 5 commitment to go to war for 29 nations, some of which, like Montenegro, most Americans have never even heard of, he's headed for the most brutal battle of his presidency. The Helsinki hysteria is but a taste. By cheering Brexit, dissing the EU, suggesting NATO is obsolete, departing from Syria, trying to get on with Putin, Trump is threatening the entire U.S. foreign policy establishment with what it fears most, irrelevance. For if there's no war on, no war imminent, and no war wanted, what does a war party do? And since the war party includes the leadership of both major political parties, the intelligence community, CIA, NSA, and so forth, the Pentagon, and much of the American political establishment, the war party is horrified at the fear that peace may break out in the Trump administration. That seems to me to be an accurate description of what is actually going on with the Russiagate nonsense, even if it comes from Pat Buchanan, who, by the way, once ran for president himself, twice ran for president himself. Pat Buchanan, known as a paleoconservative and a courtier of the Nixon presidency, but then the Nixon presidency is pretty thoroughly mythologized in American politics as well. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the sorts of things that are going on in Washington this week in regard to war and the sorts of things that are not, for the most part, being reported by the American media and that we, as Americans, should know about in order to stymie the constant press for war that is coming from the American political establishment. There are, of course, as I mentioned earlier, many wars, and more than a half a dozen, wars going on around the world being prosecuted by the U.S. government right now, as they have been for many years. This is the 16th year of our war in Afghanistan, where we've been killing Afghans because we think they might have some connection with terrorists, including the terrorists of the 9/11, 2001 attacks on New York and Washington. This is a shameful matter. The greatest crime of this century, the new century, is probably the attack on Iraq, which may have killed 1 million people. But the attack on Afghanistan, which hasn't quite reached that number yet, even though it's gone on for much longer, is a candidate for that list of international crimes that the U.S. So shamefully leads. I wonder if it would be worthwhile for a minute to think about an aspect of that war making that goes on continuously under the political games playing that we hear about in the American media, or more importantly, that we don't hear about in the American media. This is a piece from A friend of this program, Kathy Kelly, the head of the group Voices for Creative Nonviolence in Chicago. She's been our guest on this program before, and she has been regularly a visitor to Afghanistan and an active participant in attempts to support the opposition to the war, to the U.S. war in Afghanistan. This column begins with the quotation, "If they would just confirm to us that my brother is alive, if they would just let us see him, that's all we want. But we can't get anyone to give us any confirmation. My mother dies 100 times every day. They don't know what that is like," close quote. In July of 2018, an Amnesty International report entitled "God Only Knows If He's Alive" documented the plight of dozens of families in southern Yemen whose loved ones have been tortured, killed, or forcibly disappeared by Yemeni security forces reporting to the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, a collection of political misshapen examples along the Persian Gulf. The UAE is part of the Saudi-led coalition that, with vital U.S. support, has been bombarding and blockading famine and disease-ravaged Yemen for 3 brutal years. The disappearances and torture can sadly be laid at the doorstep of the United States. One testimonial after another echoes the sentiments of a woman whose husband had been held incommunicado for more than 2 years. Quote, "Shouldn't they be given a trial?" she asked. "Why else are there courts? They shouldn't be disappeared this way. Not only are we unable to visit them, we don't even know if they are dead or alive." The report describes bureaucratic farces in which families beg for information about their loved ones' whereabouts from Yemeni prosecutors and prison officials, but the family pleas for information are routinely met with silence or intimidation. The families are appealing to an unelected Yemeni exile government whose president, Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi, when elected president in 2012, he was the only candidate, generally resides in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The UAE has so far supported Hadi's claim to govern Yemen. However, the prosecutor general of Hadi's government, as well as other officials, told Amnesty International the government of Yemen has no control over operations spearheaded by the UAE and implemented by the Yemeni forces it backs. The Yemen government is a facade for this control by the Arab governments of the Gulf, notably Saudi Arabia. When months and years pass and families of people who are missing still have no news about their loved ones, some try to communicate unofficially with prison guards or with former detainees who have been released from various detention sites. They repeatedly hear stories about torture of detainees and rumors about prisoners who died in custody. The Amnesty report implicates UAE-backed local forces in Yemen, as well as the UAE military, in the crimes of torture and other ill treatment of detainees. Of 7 former or current detainees interviewed by Amnesty, 5 said they were subjected to these abuses. Quote, "All 7 witnessed other detainees being tortured," the report adds, including one who said he saw a detainee held in a cell next to him being carried away in a body bag after he'd been repeatedly tortured, close quote. In June 2017, Human Rights Watch and the Associated Press exposed a network of clandestine prisons operated by the UAE and Yemen. The reports described ghastly torture inflicted on prisoners and noted that senior U.S. military leaders knew about the torture allegations. Yet a year later, there has been no investigation of these allegations by the Yemeni government, by the UAE, or by the UAE's most powerful ally in the Yemen war, the United States. Quote, "It's shocking to say the least," the Amnesty report states, that 1 year after a network of secret prisons operated by the UAE and the Yemeni forces it backs was exposed, these facilities continued to operate, and there has not been a serious investigation undertaken into credibly documented violations, including systematic torture in custody. Close quote. The Amnesty report calls on the U.S. to facilitate independent oversight, including by the U.S. Congress, over U.S. military or intelligence cooperation with Yemeni and UAE forces involved in detention activities in Yemen. It further calls for investigating the involvement of U.S. military or intelligence personnel in detention-related abuses in Yemen. To date, the U.S. continues selling weapons to the UAE and to its coalition partner, Saudi Arabia, despite several congressional debates and a few increasingly close votes demanding a full or partial end to U.S. weapons sales, considering the terrible practices being carried out as part of the Yemen war. Since March of 2015, a coalition of 9 countries led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE and relying on crucial U.S. logistical aid has bombarded Yemen while blockading its major port, despite Yemen's status as one of the poorest countries in the world. Targeting transportation, electrical plants, sewage and sanitation facilities, schools, mosques, weddings, and funerals, the vicious bombing has led to starvation, displacement, and the spread of disease, including cholera. On the same day that the Amnesty report was released, Saudi Arabia's King Salman pardoned, quote, "all military men who have taken part in the Operation Restoring Hope of their respective military and disciplinary penalties in regard of some rules and disciplines," close quote. Operation Restoring Hope is the attack on Yemen. It seems likely that the Amnesty report precipitated this royal decree. Along with 3 countries in North Africa's Sahel Desert region, Yemen has been cited as part of the worst famine crisis in the 70-year history of the UN. In the past 3 years of aerial and naval attacks, Yemen's key port of Hodeidah has remained partially or fully closed, despite the country's vital need for relief supplies. And while Yemenis suffer the chaos and despair characteristic of war, the Saudis and UAE refer to the war as Operation Restoring Hope. The U.S. is not foreign to this sort of misrepresentation. Many thousands of Yemenis, subject to consistent bombing and threats of starvation and famine, have fled their homes. Many seek refuge out of Yemen. For example, close to 500 Yemenis have traveled nearly 500 miles to reach a visa-free port on South Korea's Jeju Island. On July 21st, during an international phone call hosted by Young Friends in Afghanistan, this is Kathy Kelly from Forces of Creative Nonviolence in Chicago, describing it, listeners heard Kaya, a resident of Jeju Island, describe the Hope School. She explained how she and several other young people are trying to welcome Yemenis now living in their village of Ganjong. The young people are already committed to peacefully resisting U.S. and South Korean military destruction of their shoreline and ecosystem. Now they started an informal school so Yemeni and South Korean residents can learn from one another. Small groups gather for conversational exchanges translated from Arabic to English to Korean. Many South Koreans can recall in their own familial history that 7 million Koreans fled Japanese occupation of their land. Their Korean forebears relied on hospitality from people in other lands. The Catholic bishop of the Jeju Diocese, Monsignor Kang Woo-il, called on Koreans to embrace Yemeni refugees, labeling it a crime against human morality to shut the door on refugees and migrants. Kaya's account of the newly launched school describes an effort that truthfully involves restoring hope. The cynical designation of Saudi and UAE-led war in Yemen as Operation Restoring Hope creates an ugly smokescreen that distracts from the crucial need to investigate war crimes committed in Yemen today. U.S. citizens bear responsibility for the U.S. government's support of these crimes. The Yemenis mean us no harm and have committed no crime against us. Congressional votes have come quite close with bipartisan support to ending U.S. participation in and support for the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition war against Yemen. Ending arms sales to the UAE and Saudi monarchies, supported by both sides of the aisles, Republicans and Democrats in the U.S., will signal to the UAE and Saudi Arabia the U.S. will no longer assist their efforts to prolong war and siege in Yemen. On cue from the initiative and energy shown by young South Koreans, people in the U.S. can and should organize campaigns to educate their communities, educational institutions, and media outlets about the plight of the people in Yemen. Conscious of the nightmare faced by Yemenis whose husbands, brothers, fathers, and sons have been disappeared or detained by shadowy military enforcers, U.S. people can work toward implementing each recommendation in Amnesty's devastating report. There is a good deal of dismay in Washington about the ability to get anyone in the Congress to take seriously the crimes that the U.S. is supporting and has been supporting for a long time in Yemen. And one can hope that this might change, that the attention of the Congress to questions of war and peace will turn to the wars that the U.S. is supporting and prosecuting around the world, and do something to begin to end the great crime that support for the Saudi and Emirati forces in Yemen are committing. You're listening to Aware on the Air. We're talking about the news of war that you will not hear for the most part on the mainstream media, and we have several other examples to mention today. I think maybe we'll go now to the matter that is occupying so much of the actual political discussion in the United States, and that is the Russiagate matter, the charge that the discouraging moves towards peace, discouraging to the American political establishment, which depends upon war and rumors of war to maintain its worldwide economic control, that those tales of war and rumors of war that have been dubbed Russiagate are not only false, but dangerously false, and in service to a political agenda of the American War Party, that commitment, or that group that is committed to maintaining those war provocations by the United States, and includes most of the major political figures in the American political establishment. This is from the important group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and is entitled The Utility of the Russiagate Conspiracy. It argues that the new McCarthyism, and you have to be my age to remember what McCarthyism was in the first place, but you may have read about it, the machinations of Senator Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s about communist conspiracies in the American government, communist conspiracies that were sapping the vital war-making spirit of the Americans in the 1950s. It was dangerous nonsense then, and its reappearance today is not only amazing in itself, but at least as dangerous as McCarthyism was almost 60 years ago. The new McCarthyism, Fair argues, allows corporate media to tighten its grip and the Democrats to ignore their own failings. To the shock of many, Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential elections becoming the 45th President of the United States. Not least shocked were the corporate media and the political establishment more generally. The Princeton Election Consortium confidently predicted an over 99% chance of a Clinton victory, while MSNBC's Rachel Maddow said it could be a Goldwater-style landslide, referring to the defeat of Barry Goldwater in 1964 in that year's presidential election. Indeed, Hillary Clinton and her team actively attempted to secure a Trump primary victory. They meddled to support Trump in the primaries, assured that he would be the easiest candidate to beat. The Podesta emails, the emails of Clinton's campaign manager, show that her team considered even before the primaries that associating Trump with Vladimir Putin and Russia would be a winning strategy, and employed the tactic throughout 2016 and beyond. They must have had people advising them, as I say, as old as I am, who remember the first McCarthyism and figured, hey, we can do that again. With Clinton claiming, quote, Putin would rather have a puppet as president, close quote, she's referring, of course, to Trump, Russia was by far the most discussed topic during the presidential debates. It's hard to remember that if you actually subjected yourself to the Clinton-Trump presidential debate. It's hard to remember that Russia was a major topic, easily eclipsing health care, terrorism, poverty, and inequality. Media seized upon the theme, with Paul Krugman, the quote liberal, close quote, columnist for the New York Times, asserting Trump would be a, quote, Siberian candidate, close quote. I don't know whether he was confusing Siberia, a Siberian candidate with a Manchurian candidate, but that seems to be what he was after. While ex-CIA Director Michael Hayden claimed Trump would be Russia's, quote, useful fool. Now, this is during the campaign, in fact, early on in the presidential campaign, and a conscious program of the Clinton campaign. The day after the election, Jonathan Allen's book Shattered detailed. So let me say that again. The day after the election, Jonathan Allen's book, Shattered, detailed that Clinton's team decided that the proliferation of Russian-sponsored fake news online was the primary reason for their loss. Couldn't be anything else. Couldn't be people actually rejecting what Clinton seemed to promise in terms of a presidential term. Within weeks, the Washington Post was publicizing the website propornot.com. Propornot.com, a shadowy operation. The name is to suggest propaganda or not, which purports to help users differentiate sources as fake or genuine as an invaluable tool in the battle against fake news. The website soberly informs its readers that you see news sources critiquing the mainstream media, the EU, NATO, Obama, Clinton, Angela Merkel, or other centrists are a telltale sign of Russian propaganda. If they do that, they got to be Russian. It also claims that when news sources argue against foreign intervention and war with Russia, that's evidence that you're reading Kremlin-penned fake news. Propornot claims it has identified over 200 popular websites that, quote, routinely peddle Russian propaganda, close quote. Included in the list were WikiLeaks, Trump-supporting right-wing websites like InfoWars and the Drudge Report, libertarian outlets like the Ron Paul Institute and Anywar.com, and award-winning anti-Trump, but also Clinton-critical, left-wing sites like TruthDig and Naked Capitalism. Thus, it was uniquely news sources that did not lie in the fairway between Clinton Democrats and moderate Republicans that were tamed as propaganda, those outside the limits of allowable debate, in other words. Proper Not calls for an FBI investigation into the news sources listed. Even its creators see the resemblance to a new McCarthyism, as it appears as a frequently asked question on their website. They say it is not McCarthyism because, quote, we're not accusing anyone of law-breaking, treason, or being a member of the Communist Party. However, this new McCarthyism does not stem from the conservative right like before, as it did 60 years ago, but from the establishment center. That the list is so evidently flawed and its creators refuse to reveal their identities or funding did not stop the issue from becoming one of the most discussed in mainstream circles. Media talk of fake news sparked organizations like Google, Facebook, Bing, and YouTube to change their algorithms, ostensibly to combat it. However, one major effect of the change has been to hammer progressive outlets that challenge the status quo. The Intercept, a progressive outlet under this description, reported a 19% reduction in Google search traffic, Alternet 63%, and Democracy Now! 36%. I'm not suggesting any of these sites are free of appropriate criticism. I am thinking that they were amazingly tabbed as Russian meddling by the Proper Not site. Reddit and Twitter deleted thousands of accounts, while in what came to be called the adpocalypse, YouTube began demonetizing videos, I guess they did that too, demonetizing videos from independent creators like Majority Report and The Jimmy Dore Show on controversial political topics like environmental protests, war, and mass shootings. In contrast, corporate outlets like CNN did not have their content on those subjects demonetized. Journalists that question aspects of the Russian narrative, like Glenn Greenwald and Aaron Mate, were accused of being agents of the Kremlin. The effect has been to pull away the financial underpinnings of alternative media that question the corporate state and capitalism in general, and to reassert corporate control over communication, something that had been loosened during the election in particular. You may have noticed, of course, that Aware on the Air is immune to having its corporate monies and its financial support interfered with. We have none. It also impels liberal journalists to prove their loyalty by employing sufficiently bellicose and anti-Russian rhetoric, lest they also be tarred as Kremlin agents. Thomas Friedman, the New York Times bloviator, pointedly compared email hacking to events that the U.S. responded to with major wars. The hacking of the Democratic National Committee emails he compared to Pearl Harbor. When it was reported in February that 13 Russian trolls have been indicted by a U.S. grand jury for sharing and promoting pro-Trump and anti-Clinton memes on Facebook, the response was a general uproar. Multiple senior political figures declared it a, quote, act of war, close quote. Clinton herself described Russian interference as, quote, a cyber 9/11, while Thomas Friedman said that it was a Pearl Harbor scale event. Morgan Freeman's viral video, produced by Rob Reiner's Committee to Investigate Russia, summed up the outrage. Quote, we have been attacked, the actor declared. We are at war with Russia, close quote. Liberals declared Trump's refusal to react in a sufficiently aggressive manner further proof he was Putin's puppet. This is coming quite remarkably from various places on the political spectrum, but very much from the centrist political establishment. The McCarthyist wave swept over other politicians that challenged the liberal center. Green Party presidential candidate, full disclosure, I'm a member of the Green Party and was once a Green Party candidate, Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein refused to endorse the Russia narrative, leading mainstream figures like Rachel Maddow to insinuate that Stein was a Kremlin stooge as well. After news broke that Stein's connection to Russia was being officially investigated, top Clinton staffer Zek Pekanis announced, "Jill Stein is a Russian agent. Jill 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 Stein is a Russian agent." That's the entire publicity release from the Clinton campaign. Commentary that succinctly summed up the political atmosphere. In contrast, Bernie Sanders has consistently and explicitly endorsed the Russiagate theory, claiming it is clear to everyone, I'm quoting now, Bernie Sanders wrote, "It is clear to everyone except Donald Trump that Russia was deeply involved in the 2016 election and intends to be involved in 2018, close quote. Despite his stance, Sanders has also been constantly presented as another Russian agent, with the Washington Post asking its readers, quote, "When Russia interferes with the 2020 election on behalf of Democratic nominee Bernie Sanders, how will liberals respond?" Close quote. The message is clear. The progressive wave rising across America is and will be a consequence of Russia, not of the failures of the system, nor of the Democrats. Outlets like Slate, an online magazine, warned of a sinister connection between Black Lives Matter and Russia. It is not just politicians who's been speared as Russian agents, witting or unwitting. Virtually every major progressive movement challenging the system is increasingly dismissed in the same way. Multiple media outlets, including CNN, Slate, Vox, and the New York Times, have produced articles linking Black Lives Matter to the Kremlin, insinuating the outrage over racist police brutality is another Russian psyop. Others claim Russia funded the riots in Ferguson and that Russian trolls promoted the Standing Rock environmental protests. Meanwhile, Democratic insider Neera Tanden retweeted a description of Chelsea Manning as a, quote, Russian stooge, close quote, writing off her campaign for the Senate as, quote, the Kremlin paying the extreme left to swing elections. Remember that, close quote. Thus, corporate media are promoting the idea that any challenge to the establishment is likely a Kremlin-funded astroturf effort. The tactic is spread to Europe as well. After the poisoning of Russian double agent Sergei Skripal, the UK government immediately blamed Russia and imposed sanctions without publicly presenting evidence. Jeremy Corbyn, the pacifist leftist leader of the Labour Party, was uncharacteristically bellicose, saying, quote, the Russian authorities must be held to account on the basis of the evidence, and our response must be both decisive and proportionate. The British press was outraged at Corbyn's insufficient jingoism. The Sun, a major British paper, front page attacked him as Putin's puppet, while the Daily Mail went with Corbyn the Kremlin stooge. As with Sanders, the fact that Corbyn endorsed the official narrative didn't keep him from being attacked, showing that the conspiratorial mindset seeing Russia behind everything has little to do with evidence-based reality and is increasingly a tool to demonize the establishment's political enemies. The Atlantic Council, establishment think tank in America, published a report claiming Greek political parties Syriza and Golden Dawn were not expressions of popular frustration and disillusionment, but, quote, the Kremlin's Trojan horses, undermining democracy in its birthplace. Providing scant evidence, the report went on to link virtually every major European political party challenging the center, from right or left, to Putin. From Britain's UKIP to Spain's Podemos to Italy's Five Star Movement, all are charged with being under one man's control, Vladimir Putin. It is this council that Facebook announced it was partnering with to help promote trustworthy news and weed out untrustworthy sources, as its CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, met with representatives from some of the largest corporate outlets like the New York Times, CNN, and News Corp to help develop a system to control what content we see on the website. We are at war, Morgan Freeman assures us on behalf of his committee to investigate Russia. The utility of this wave of suspicion is captured in Freeman's video. There's a link to it here in the note, which I will place on the website for Aware, on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. After asserting that, quote, for 241 years, our democracy has been a shining example to the world of what we can all aspire to, close quote, a tally that would count nearly a century of chattel slavery and almost another 100 years of de jure racial disenfranchisement, the actor explains that, quote, Putin uses social media to spread propaganda and false information. He convinces people in democratic societies to distrust their media, their political process, close quote. The obvious implication is that the political process and media ought to be trusted and would be trusted were it not for Putin's propaganda. It was not the failures of capitalism and the deep inequalities it created that led to widespread popular resentment and movements on both left and right pressing for radical change across Europe and America, but Vladimir Putin himself. In other words, America is already great. For the Democrats, Russiagate allows them to ignore calls for change and not scrutinize why they lost to the most unpopular presidential candidate in history, Donald Trump. Since Russia hacked the election, there is no need for introspection and certainly no need to accommodate the Sanders wing or to engage with progressive challenge from activists on the left, who are Putin's puppets anyway. The party can continue on the same course, painting over the deep cracks in American society. Similarly, for centrists in Europe, under threat from both left and right, the Russia narratives allows them to sow distrust among the public for any movement challenging the dominant order. For the state, Russiagate has encouraged liberals to forego their faculties and develop a state-worshipping conspiratorial mindset in the face of a common manufactured enemy. Liberal trust in institutions like the FBI has markedly increased since 2016, while liberals also now espouse a neocon foreign policy in Syria, Ukraine, and other regions, with many supporting the vast increase in the U.S. military budget and attacking Trump from the right. For corporate media, too, the disciplining effect of the Russia narrative is highly useful, allowing them to reassert control over the means of communication under the guise of preventing a Russia fake news infiltration. News sources that challenge the establishment are censored, defunded, or deranked as corporate sources stoke mistrust of them. Meanwhile, it allows them to portray themselves as arbiters of truth. The strategy has had some success, with Democrats' trust in media increasing since the election. None of this is to say that Russia does not strive to influence other countries' elections, a tactic the United States has employed even more frequently. Yet the extent to which the story has dominated the U.S. media to the detriment of other issues is a remarkable testament to its utility for those in power. And the only point that I would add to that is, of course, those in power know that the foreign policy and the economic policy of the U.S. establishment depends upon preparations for war, war provocations, and actual wars in a number of countries around the world. The Russiagate matter is not just a propaganda campaign, it's the foreign policy of the United States. You have been watching Aware on the Air in the 31st week of 2018, another week in which the U.S. government remains what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. We must stop it. There's a regular AWARE demonstration that's coming Saturday afternoon from 2 to 4 p.m. These demonstrations have been a feature of the local anti-war movement going back to the invasion of Afghanistan and before, in other words, for 16 years. The regular demonstration will take place this Saturday from 2 to 4 p.m. at Main and Neal Streets in downtown Champaign. Our program is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. Our thanks also to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes will be posted on the Facebook page for AWARE on the Air. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, reminding you in the words of Edward de Vere in the play The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. Good night.